Hello everybody, and welcome to the first edition of the Bread Garden Market Cheese Club. For the first month, in the first edition of the Cheese Club, we are going to be focusing on U.S. cheesemakers. Now, the United States makes some of the best cheese in the world. Over the last 40 years, they have quickly caught up to some of the best European cheese-making countries, specifically Spain, France, Italy, not only in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality. The diverse geography, climate, topography of the United States makes it ideal for not only making fantastic wines, but for making fantastic cheeses. And great artisanal makers around the country have certainly taken advantage of these advantages. The U.S. has not always been a fantastic cheese-making country. If we kind of rewind back to the 1970s, convenience was the name of the game in all things food. So we're talking about the introduction of things like hamburger helper, shake and bake, TV dinners were becoming bigger. It was all about convenience, not necessarily about quality. And what about the cheese? Well, Americans were known for their love affair of these really waxy orange cheese slices that we simply called American or American cheese, and of course Velveeta. So to say our cheese industry has come very far over the last 40 or 50 years would be a gross understatement. Now, how did we go from eating waxy orange American cheese slices and Velveeta to creating some of the best cheese in the world? That's something we'll be exploring today in the class. And then we'll kind of narrow our focus down and explore some really fantastic cheese producers, some from the early pioneers of the late 70s, early 80s, to some fantastic new cheese producers, and one in particular that's extremely hard and rare to find that we're able to procure just for the class. So let's get started, and I hope you'll enjoy. So let's go briefly into what changed in the U.S. cheese industry and how the U.S. gained such a great reputation for cheese making in such a short time. I think it is important to note and kind of remember that nothing happens in and of itself. There's a lot of moving parts that helped the cheese industry to grow, and it was very much interconnected to the growth of the wine industry and the growth of the restaurant industry. So whether we're talking about fine dining per se, or even things like farm to table, or just general overall improvement in quality of food in restaurants and using fresh products and great ingredients, all interconnects with what we're talking about here. So for example, if I'm using California as kind of a microcosm of how the cheese industry blew up, California in the late 70s, you had kind of a wine revolution where the wine industry in California exploded for a number of reasons. You also had the creation of Chez Panisse by Alice Waters, which is and was and still is a fantastic restaurant, but was considered by many to be the best restaurant in the U.S. from the late 70s through the early 80s, and like I said, it still continues today to be an outstanding restaurant. What does that have to do with cheese? Well, you need to have a market for the cheese. You know, there were artisanal cheesemakers in the U.S. in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, but where are they selling their cheeses? There aren't any fancy cheeses in supermarkets. There are very few specialty cheese stores around. There's a few in New York, a few in San Francisco. But other than that, outside of farmers markets, where are these cheese producers bringing their wares? All of a sudden you have the rise of Chez Panisse, the growth of the restaurant industry, and now cheesemakers have another avenue to go to sell their cheeses. And all of a sudden, through the very old school method of advertising, like word of mouth, you have great cheeses in this great restaurant, and these great restaurants that are popping up all over the country. People are talking about them, chefs are excited about them, and all of a sudden people are asking, hey, do you have any of that Cypress Grove Humboldt Frog from Mary Keene out of California? Or hey, do you have any of the Grand Verano from Major Farms out of Vermont? And the industry takes off, but it's all interconnected. The growth of the cheese industry taking off at the same time as the growth of the restaurant industry. Again, we're talking about fine dining, and we're talking about farm to table, and we're talking about improved quality, and the wine industry is all very interconnected. It happens at the same time. It's not a coincidence. So I made a huge mistake when I decided to name the first month of the Cheese Club, or the first edition of the Cheese Club, Great Cheeses or Great Cheesemakers of the U.S. I discovered really quickly that was much, much too broad of a category. And then I was kind of stuck with figuring out, well, how am I going to break this down? There's all these great cheese producers, and I'm narrowing it down to 3 to maybe 4 producers. And it was quite difficult. So I broke it down in a way that kind of made sense in my head. Hopefully it makes sense to you. I talked about the great kind of cheese revolution in the US in the 70s, and especially through the mid-80s. So I wanted to get somebody who was still around from that era, who's still making fantastic cheese. And so we're going to do something from Capriole a little later on called Sophia. And then I wanted to do kind of someone who represented kind of the second revolution of great cheese making in the US. And that kind of happened in the mid to late 90s and early aughts. And so I decided to do a dairy and a cheesemaker or cheesemakers, excuse me, who are very special to me. Sue Connolly and Peg Smith. We're going to do their Mount Tam. And so we have kind of an old guard, kind of a middle guard that started kind of the second big boom in the cheese industry. And then I kind of wanted a new or newer cheese producer, someone who kind of made a mark in the 2011-2012 range. So we're going to be talking about Central Coast Creamery, a fantastic dairy that's been around for since 2011, I say, so about 9 years or so, and just kind of burst onto the cheese scene and has been making fantastic cheese ever since. And then I wanted to get something that was really rare, really hard to get, something kind of that is unique and just something we don't carry typically in the store. And so we're able to do that with the Verano cheese from Good Shepherd Majored Farms. So that's kind of how we're going to break it down here. And we're kind of going to go in the order that if you were to make a cheese board, this is the order you would want to serve these cheeses in. So we're kind of going to go by softest bloomy rind, into the goat, into the Great California Eureka from Central Coast Creamery, and then we're going to end with the Verano from Major Farms, Good Shepherd. So now let's get into some cheese. So the first cheese we're going to do is from a very famous dairy in California by the Point Reyes area called Cowgirl Creamery. Cowgirl Creamery holds a very special place in my heart. It's the dairy that actually got me into cheese as a passion. When I first tried Mount Tam and Red Hawk, they're probably 2 most famous cheeses. It just absolutely blew me away. I didn't realize cheese could taste this good. This was back in 2000, 2001. I was just getting into the wine business. Tasted these guys, a friend brought them into the shop, blew me away, and all of a sudden I fell in love with cheese. So we're going to start with the bloomy rind from Cowgirl Creamery, Mount Tam. So when I say bloomy rind, think brie. We're going to be talking about cheese that kind of has that fluffy white exterior, and then when it's young, it has almost kind of a cakey, thick texture on the inside, and as it gets older, it tends to get kind of creamy on the outside, and sometimes a little runny. So, as I finish taking the wrapper off, you can see what I mean now by bloomy rind. Looks like a brie. Tastes like a brie. Really good brie. That's because essentially it is, except it's not from France, it's from California. So bloomy rind, think bries. Just kind of cut into this bad boy, just to give you a sense of the texture. You see it's still kind of firm, so not rummy or runny. Rummy is something else. And Mount Tam will get a little softer, but it tends to keep for at least 45 to 60 days after it's produced this kind of semi-firmish texture for a cheese that is in essence a brie. So now what we'll do is I'll cut a little piece for myself, and maybe a little piece for the young man who's filming this. whose time I'm wasting apparently. So basically, when you're eating cheese, you don't want to serve it cold. If you're going to make a cheese board, you want a little cheese for a snack, take the cheese out of the fridge. Let it sit out for at least 30 minutes, up to an hour, even an hour and a half. Think about what cold does to flavor. Cold masks flavor. Whether you're talking about beer or wine or anything, vegetables, the colder something is, the more flavors you mask. And that certainly holds true of cheese as well. So don't be afraid to let the cheese sit out. Cheese can sit out for an hour, 2 hours at a time, and it's fine. You know, with little creamier cheeses like brie or softer blue cheeses, maybe only give them an hour, but ultimately take the cheese out, try to bring it up to room temp. So tasting the cheese, it's delicious, super buttery, super creamy, kind of melts in your mouth, a little mushroomy, a little mineral tang on the finish, but just fantastic stuff. Would go perfect with some champagne, would go fantastic on a piece of baguette with a little prosciutto, but simply wonderful. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Now let's move on to our second cheese. Now our second cheese is from a kind of old school, pioneering, trailblazing cheese-making group that arose in the late 70s, early 80s. And specifically with this one, we're talking more mid-80s. But we're talking about Judy Shad, who is the cheesemaker and owner of Capriole. Capriole is known as one of the best goat cheese dairies in all of the US. And they make incredible goat cheeses. Most of the goat cheeses are kind of started off at least as homages to the great goat cheeses of France and specifically the Loire Valley. And then over time they kind of gradually became Judy's own cheese. They still had that kind of French Loire tradition to them, but in a very American and Indiana, which is where Judy and the dairy is from, way. So the second cheese is one of my favorite goat cheeses from Capriole, and just one of my favorite goat cheeses, period. Now we're gonna unwrap it here, and you may notice it's a little gooey as it kind of unsticks, and it's got kind of a very unusual, to most people, strange kind of color to it. So basically you have the white, again not quite bloomy, but a very fresh, soft ripened cheese. So similar to a bloomy rind, but kind of the dark gray is literally ash. Ash has almost always been used, at least for the last 400 years, in the process of goat cheese making. Not every goat cheese is what they call ash ripened, ASH. Very important we get the ash ripened part correct. But a lot of goat cheeses are, and that's for a number of reasons. Before refrigeration, ash was used as a way to help preserve food a little bit, especially with stuff like cheese that wouldn't last very long. But with goat cheese, ash plays another very important role. Ash is a pure base, essentially. And goat's milk is a little more acidic than, say, cow's milk or sheep's milk. So what ash does as a base is it tempers that acidity down a little bit. So it tempers down that natural tang in goat cheese. Now, some people like the sharp tang of goat cheese. I love it. Tang, very important distinction, is kind of a brightness, something that you feel on the side of your mouth, maybe make your mouth water a little bit. When you're talking about goat cheese, tang or tanginess is very different from goatiness. Like when I have customers who come in and say, I don't like goat cheese, they're too goaty. A good goat cheese should never be goaty. Tangy, yes, delicious, bright, mouth-watering. Goaty and animally, no. So if you're having goat cheeses that taste goaty, you're getting a pretty badly made goat cheese. All right, so back to the Sophia. So this is an ash-ripened goat cheese, which you see a lot in the Loire Valley in France, and you see a lot now in the US. A lot of people are familiar with Mary Keane's Humboldt Fog. another very famous American ash-ripened goat cheese. So it's a little delicate. It always comes in this kind of rectangular prism type shape, this block. We'll kind of cut this with the wire because I don't want to mess around with the inside. I don't want it to kind of move around too much, and the wire is a good way to kind of get a nice super clean cut. And you can see there's also ash running through the center of the cheese. So basically you've got a layer of cheese, ash, layer of cheese, ash, layer of cheese. So again, very common ash ripened goat cheese from the fantastic producer Judy Shad out of Capriole. This specifically is the Sophia. And she was one of the first fine artisanal goat cheese producers in all of the US. So we're going to taste this now. The ash is just vegetal. It's perfectly fine. So it's going to take longer than I should. You still get the tanginess of the goat cheese, but again, tempered down because of the ash. Quite delicious, a little earthy, a little citrusy, nice and bright. This is really good. And as it gets older, this creme line right around the ash, right around the rind, will get super gooey and even a little runny, and you'll get kind of more earthy flavors, almost like forest floor type stuff going on. It gets a little, not funky, not like a wash rind cheese, but just a little earthier. So, fantastic Capriole Sophia from Judy Shad, pioneering cheesemaker out of Indiana. Wonderful cheese. All right, so we're leaving our goat cheese, leaving the old school Judy Shad, Capriole, Sophia, pioneering, to more new school cheese. In particular, here we're talking about Central Coast Creamery and one of their great cheeses, Eureka. Central Coast Creamery was founded back in 2012, so pretty young in terms of how long they've been around, 8 years or so, I guess 9 years now that it's 2021. Reggie Jones was in the cheese industry previous to becoming a cheesemaker, fell in love with cheese, decided to start making his own cheese, bought some animals, bought some land, and kind of followed through on his dream. And he had a number of cheeses in mind that he wanted to do when he first started. One of them was Eureka. Although he pictured Eureka as a sheep milk cheddar. During his time in the cheese industry, he noticed there wasn't a whole lot of sheep cheddars out there. He saw plenty of cow milk cheddar. Goat milk cheddar was kind of up and coming. You can see a little more goat milk cheddar, and there are some around. Not a lot of sheep milk cheddar. And sheep milk produces delicious cheese. Why are we making cheddar from this milk? So he kind of discovered the answer to his question pretty quickly, and probably not in a way that he wanted or expected. You see, sheep milk cheese, or sheep milk, excuse me, has about twice the amount of protein and fat of goat milk or cow milk. So essentially what we're talking about is it has almost twice the amount of solids in sheep milk compared to the other major animals that produce cheese. So what happens is, when you're forming the curd is a lot denser than what you would get from a cow or a goat. And when you're making cheddar, one of the important and proper steps to making good cheddar is to take kind of a large, it's almost like the top of a heart. You take this large wire cutter, and you take the curds, which are in one giant block, usually in a vat of some sort, and you just kind of take the cheese cutter, the wire cutters, and you kind of run them up and down the vat, and you make really small cubes. The problem with the wire cutter, though, when you're dealing with sheep milk and sheep milk curds, because they're so dense and thick, the wire cutter will get jammed, it's hard to push through, and you're not getting those uniform cuts that you want. They're not getting as small as you want. They're becoming jagged and broken off. So the reason why you don't see a lot of sheep milk cheddar is because it's pretty difficult to make. It's also an availability issue. Sheep, although they have more milk solids in the forms of protein and fat, sheep produce a lot less milk than cow and goat. So what that means is there's not as much sheep milk available, and whereas cheddar is more of a, there's some great cheddar out there, there are incredible cheddars out there, but most of the cheddar market is kind of mass production. You don't see a lot of mass production sheep milk cheeses out there because it's impossible. They produce so little milk during the lactation cycle. You're not going to waste that precious, delicious sheep milk by making cheddar. So what he ends up with is something he becomes very proud of, and rightfully so, is the Eureka. So the Eureka is this kind of happily semi-successful, semi-failed attempt at sheep milk cheddar. So, and it's kind of, you'll see when we cut into it, it's kind of a cross between cheddar and like a French Pyrenees cheese, almost like Assuerati. So a French or Spanish mountain cheese. So kind of let's cut in. We use our bigger cheese knife for this guy. I'm reminded of that famous SNL skit back in the 70s where Dan Aykroyd played Julia Child. She was cutting a turkey, cut the dickens out of her finger. There was blood, fake blood everywhere. It's actually quite a funny skit. I'm hoping that doesn't happen here. I have a feeling my cameraman Gil would just run out in fear. He saw me cut a finger off and blood squirting everywhere. So, there's the interior. You can see kind of white, gold on the outside, kind of really nice. A little bit of, can't really see it from here, but a little bit of tyrosine crystal, those little flavor crystals you get. It's not aged that long. It's only aged for about 4 months or so. But because of the richness of the milk and the quality of the cheese making, it develops an incredible amount of flavor in that short amount of time. So I'm just going to kind of cut a piece that will suit what I want in terms of good size for 2 or 3 people. Cut a little piece off. I will taste, just like wine, very important to smell. 95% of what you taste comes from your sense of smell. Don't swish around cheese, that's really weird. So give it a sniff. Yeah, that's awesome. So, does have some of that cheddar bite. Does have a little bit of almost aged Gouda to it, and then a nice nuttiness of like a sheep milk mountain cheese. It's just awesome. This cheese has won a lot of awards over the years. There are very few cheesemakers who came out of the gate quicker than Reggie Jones, the owner and cheesemaker at Central Coast Creamery, in terms of making a big splash with consumers, with connoisseurs, and with critics alike. Nothing he does is bad, and almost everything he does is absolutely excellent. Besides the nuttiness, I'm getting like butterscotch, salted caramel. It's a lot of complexity. The longer the cheese kind of sits in your mouth and lingers, the finish lasts forever. This is just an awesome, awesome cheese. I would do, if I was to pair this with something, if some of you are members of our Wine Cash Club, there's that Carignan from Emmanuel Trace that would go perfectly with this. Even that cab, the Reina cab that we have in that as well would be excellent. But I would definitely do like a hearty red with this cheese. It's beautiful. Now a quick recap. So far we've done our bloomy rind, from California, from Cowgirl Creamery. Organic, delicious, bloomy rind, brie-style cheese. We've done our ash-ripened goat cheese from Capriole, Judy Shad's Sophia. We just tasted the delicious Eureka, made from 100% sheep milk. Nutty, sharp, salty butterscotch, absolutely delicious. Central Coast Creamery, can't go wrong. And then this last cheese now is also a sheep milk cheese. So we did a cow, goat, 2 sheep. I don't find that to be very unusual for what we do here at Bread Garden and what we like to feature in our cheese cases and online. Sheep milk cheeses are my personal favorite types of cheeses, and don't get me wrong, I love all cheese. But there's a richness, there's a density. My favorite cheese in the world is Torta del Cesar from Spain, which is a washed rind sheep's milk cheese. And the cheese we're about to have next is one of my favorite cheeses in the country. This was a cheese when I first started in the cheese industry that was really weird. You never saw it. You kind of heard whispers about it. People would talk about it. You know, it's back then it was called Major Farms. Now it's called Vermont Shepherd. But have you ever tasted Major Farms before? Have you ever tasted the Verano before? Have you ever tasted the Invierno before? And you just didn't see it. Some nice high-end restaurants carried them on cheese plates occasionally. But even growing up in New York, which Vermont is actually very close to, you didn't see Vermont Shepherd all that much other than in the best cheese shops and in the best restaurants. So to get a hold of this now, to be able to get it in Iowa is a real treat. And it's a type of artisanal producer that I probably respect most, whether you're talking about wine or cheese or anything, you know, a sushi chef. You know, there are certain people, there are certain cooperatives, there are certain individuals who say, I'm only going to do one thing, and I'm going to do it better than anyone else in the world, and that's it. And I'm going to perfect my craft over the years, over the decades, and it's just going to be the best thing you've ever tasted. And that's kind of what Vermont Shepherd has done with the Verano. Vermont Shepherd only makes, technically it's 2 cheeses, but it's really just 1 cheese. They have 2 cheeses, the Verano and the Invierno, summer and winter. It's the same cheese essentially, except they're seasonal. 1 cheese they make with summer milk, the Verano, which we're going to taste today, which you're going to taste at some other time when you get your cheese package. And the other cheese they make with winter milk, and that's called Invierno. So summer, winter, same cheese. Now, are cheeses really seasonal? They very much are. First of all, sheep, goat, cows do not typically produce milk or do not produce milk all year round. They go through what's called lactation cycles. And lactation cycles for sheep are a lot shorter than lactation cycles for cows. You know, a cow will produce milk for 300 some odd days out of the year, about 305, 310, depending upon the breed of the cow. A sheep will only produce milk anywhere from 180 to 210 days out of the year. And the early milk and the summer milk especially, is different than the winter milk. In the summer, they're feeding on clover, wild herbs, grasses, in the fields, in the mountains. And they're producing a fair amount of milk. So not as fatty, not as full as protein. And then when you get into the winter, they're not producing as much milk. They're starting to have and eat winter feed. And even though they're producing less milk, more of the nutrients, more of the fat, more of the proteins are concentrated. So it's a denser milk. You get a denser cheese. So this summer cheese, in theory, and it has, I've been lucky enough to taste this before, will tend to be a little less dense than the winter cheese. It will be more herbaceous. It'll have a little earthiness and nuttiness to it, but it'll be really well balanced. The winter cheese tends to be a lot more nutty, more umami flavors, So cheese is very much seasonal, depending upon the time of year they are milking the animal to make the cheese. All right, enough about lactation cycles. Let's get to the cheese. So here's the Verano. This kind of looks like a moon rock. And this is a natural rind. Don't eat it. Some natural rinds you can eat, like the rind on the Mount Tam that we tried earlier, the rind, that ashy rind from the Capriole you can eat. Don't eat this. You can eat this. It won't hurt you. It won't necessarily make you sick. It's just chewy and it's like hard sand. I mean, don't do it. I'm going to score it because the natural rind is a little firmer with this cheese. And you can just kind of, when I took this cheese out of the packaging, I mean, the smells kind of like peppery, thyme. Flavor is just kind of jumped out, almost like a roasted garlic or caramely smell as well. Caramelized onion, I guess I should say. I'll stop talking for a second so I don't injure myself. Not sure why I'm cutting whole wheels of cheese in front of you on camera. It's not like you'll ever do this at home. And some of the texture is similar to our Eureka. The colors are not that different, which is not that surprising. We're talking about two sheep milk cheeses, both aged for about the same time. The Eureka from Central Coast was aged about 5 months, 4 months. This is aged about 5 or 6 months. They aged the winter cheese quite a bit longer, almost 9 or 10 months. So kind of similar pace to the Eureka. Now we'll cut this to more manageable bite-sized pieces. By the way, if you come into the store and you want some cheese, always ask to have it cut fresh. We cut a lot of cheese and wrap a lot of cheese, but cheese always tastes best when it's cut fresh from the wheel. It lasts longer, doesn't absorb that weird plasticky-ness from the plastic wrap. We're happy to do it for you. So, I feel like I should ask for a moment alone. That's really quite nice. It's actually a little softer, surprisingly so, than the Eureka. Not quite as firm, but I get some of that herbaceousness. I get some of that almost garlicky caramelized onion that I was talking about earlier. For a summer cheese, this has got a lot of umami flavor to it, but in a light way. It's not overpowering. It's kind of, it's there, but it's not punching you in the face. It's very much kind of in the middle to background of the cheese. And this is, you know, if you're going to compare it to a wine like a very fine Burgundy or Pinot Noir, it's got a lot of flavor, but it's also got this really beautiful elegance to it that's just outstanding. So please enjoy this. This is not something we'll be able to get all year round. The leftovers we have after the Cheese Club gets their portions will be sold at the store, and then we'll carry it as long as we can because it's really that good. But it's a cheese we'll see maybe once or twice a year. So enjoy this. It is worth every penny. It is absolutely stunning. And that's pretty much a wrap, folks. I hope you enjoyed these cheeses as much as I did. You couldn't see it behind the scenes, but as much as Gilbert, our fantastic director, did. Again, to recap, the organic Cowgirl Creamery Mount Tam, out of Indiana from Capriole, Judy Shad Sophia. And then these two wonderful sheep milk cheeses, the Eureka from Central Coast Creamery and the Vermont Shepherd Verano. I would suggest eating these two cheeses side by side, even if you didn't eat them all at once. It's really cool to take two cheeses that are aged similarly, but are kind of aged differently. This is aged in kind of slightly drier versus more humid environment. But just kind of see what you think side by side, how similar or dissimilar you think they are. If you can kind of determine the different kind of tasting notes. In some ways I felt they were very similar. In other ways I felt they were quite different. And just, yeah, I was told that with YouTube you can like us. Please like us. And leave any comments or suggestions below. I hate being in front of cameras, and I'm very uncomfortable doing all this. So feel free to give any suggestions on future classes, future endeavors, and what kind of cheeses you want to taste going forward. Thanks, and we'll see you soon.